Why is this book from 1977 way harder to achieve a 9.8 than this book just 5 years later? Let's get into it. Have you ever been down the rabbit hole of eBay looking at 2000s, 90s, and 80s books and you notice a large shortage of 70s books getting the 9.8? Today we're talking about why it is so much harder to get 9.8s out of books before 1979 versus everything that came after. This is actually one of my most requested videos. I've submitted probably about 5,000 books. It could be even more at this point in my life. I've really been around the block with submitting. And you see at almost every CGC unboxing I do, I'm always pulling out 9.8s from the batch. But you probably only see me pull 1977 or 76 9.8s once every blue moon. Mid-hunter comic moment here, 9.8. What's up with that? Quite a bit, actually. So we're going to dive in. Before we do that, don't forget, new week, new giveaway. We're going to give away another copy of that 9.8 Ghost Rider, full appearance of the Midnight Suns. You got to like and comment down below and be subscribed. The first thing we're going to talk about is how the entire nature of comics in general completely changed around 78, 79. Most of you know this, but I'll recap real quick. Around the turn of the 80s, you got your comics from supermarkets, bodegas, shops, 7-Elevens. The arrival of direct edition comic books is when actual comic book shops came around and kind of actually kicked newsstands out. It was a slow burn, like you could obviously still get your newsstands from those places. By the 90s, they were pretty much all but done. For titles such as New Teen Titans and things coming out in like 1984, the direct editions would come out first, literally de-incentivizing people to go the newsstand route. So people who wanted the newsstands had to wait. So it's no wonder why we see newsstands start to disappear even after the mid-80s. If you ever wanted to know why as time goes on the ratio of newsstands is so hilariously lower to the direct, that would account for a lot of it. There was a whole new craze of the comic book shop and actually preserving the books, whereas the newsstand, printing on crap newsstand paper, everybody reads them, throws them away, kids crap on the pages, who knows?
If you really wanted to keep a good copy, you'd probably buy it from an actual comic book shop rather than a store in which little kids' hands have been all over it. People wanted the direct editions and they wanted to keep them forever and in good condition. People didn't want the newsstands, and they started to fade into history.
So even though the Bronze Age of comics was a very heavily printed era, a lot more than the Silver Age, so you'd think you'd see tons of these lying around, it's not so much. The existing copies weren't coming from comic book shops, they were coming from these newsstands, and therefore you're just not going to find them in that condition. You're not. So you guys see me score 1982, 81, 80, sometimes even 79 9.8s on a pretty much monthly basis over here. Granted, to do that you have to be a full-time comic book hunter. You're not just coming across gorgeous looking copies of, frankly, 40-plus-year-old books every day. But that drop-off of 79, man, I swear it gets brutal, because before then, 9.8 true candidates, I'm not seeing them nearly as much. Those are all the very obvious factors, I feel, but it's more than that. Let's talk about paper quality. Paper quality was always printed on newsstand paper, and people have said that that quality actually started to decline towards the end of the 70s. So allegedly, late 70s newsprint was actually a little bit more brittle or something than the earlier 70s. Because I can't prove that, I'm going to stick with the actual facts with what I know and can confirm, which is that in the earliest of the 80s, DC and Marvel both started experimenting with new paper, getting away from actual newsprint and starting to experiment with prestige formats, various different white papers, glossies. Who of you is old enough to remember something called Baxter paper? It was all the rage. You would get things like Omega Men. Have you ever wondered why the first appearance of Logo is such a good, strong book and seems to hold up well through the years? It's because it's not on crap paper. Same thing with all the Marvel fanfare books. They're all on the following papers: Baxton, Mondo, and eventually Hudson paper. Hudson paper is a little bit more akin to what we have now with all that glossiness that you see, but not the early 2000s glossy where everything was toilet paper thin. You also saw prestige formats like famously The Dark Knight Returns, which is one of the first examples of this tougher comic book. The 90s took it to a whole other level. We're not even really going to get into it, but a quick recap is everything was practically prestige format and foil this and foil that, and even the dinkiest comic book ever had abnormally strong and airtight paper quality. That's one of the reasons they're so expensive, is they use the best of the best of the best paper possible, man. Which, by the way, I gotta tell you, the 90s is still, I think, the easiest era to get 9.8s of. The paper quality was even more improved from the 80s, and in the 2000s, they actually took a dip in paper quality. So that sweet pocket in the 90s does make that stuff the most easy 9.8s to get, even in comparison to the last 10 years, I would say. But a lot of 80s titles were on this Mando or Baxton paper. Much brighter whites, it held the ink better, there was no bleed, that sort of thing. Not all, still a large chunk of it was on this newsprint. So in addition to there being more of these things, with people actually wanting to hold onto them, the paper quality could just support the wear and tear through the years. So this stuff would sit in storage and it wouldn't bend, it wouldn't break, and you could pull it out 40 years later and get a 9.8. With 70s books, it's just not the same. It's the crappy newsprint that y'all know. Newsprint like this is more susceptible to breaks and tears and scratches and this and that's and color loss, tanning, losing of that nice bright page quality, which is why getting 9.8 specifically with white pages is a little bit of an impressive feat for 70s books. And as time goes on, it's only going to get more rare and rare. Now, what's really impressive is getting 60s 9.8s, but I digress. The last element I wanted to talk about is the stigma related to these books versus a book from, let's say, 1982. Still pretty early in the 80s, still pretty much near the end of the 70s, and yet there's a big difference. Because of the dawn of these comic book shops, people make a mental separation between the new wave of comics and the older. Some guys out there still talk about the early 80s as the new stuff. And as we obviously know, that's not so new, that some of that stuff is 40 plus years old at this point. That's the distinctions that were made. And even stuff like this, which is the tail end of the Bronze Age, is considered old. Now, because of that old stigma, people think differently and more highly of books in this era. Holds in our hearts significantly more prestige. While everybody would love to have 70s 9.8s with white pages, you're not finding them in that condition, and everyone holds them to this extra stigma of old and prestigious. So a lot of people don't like selling that stuff too. There's a reason you don't see a lot of that. So what I'm getting to is, because of that stigma, a lot of people don't like to sell the stuff. So especially for the later 70s, some of that stuff definitely does exist out there, but you're just not seeing it pop up on eBay that much because there is less of it, and people don't really want to part with that stuff. Especially due to that paper quality, I know there are still raw 9.8 candidates of almost every 80s book out there. I don't necessarily feel that way about the 70s. Some books with the 70s and especially the 60s, I do start to feel like, man, there can't be really any 9.8 copies left out there. And I think that way all the time, and that's the difference. I mentioned it in this video, the Bronze Age, specifically with Marvel, was a heavily printed era, but all paper deteriorates. There's nothing we can do about it. You can prevent it, you can prolong it, but it all deteriorates. And you would have had to have been a primo collector that never touched the stuff in order for 50 years later for it to be scoring anything like a 9.8. Don't forget that also with newsstands is sometimes things would arrive on the newsstands already damaged, held by twine or mishandled. A lot of those books just couldn't get a 9.8 even in 1975. So it's the perfect timing, perfect storm of just everything changed and the quality got better and everybody wanted it and everybody was collecting different. And that's why you can get 9.8s of 80s books out there, but it's a hell of a lot more of an achievement if you're pulling it out of the 70s. Great conversation to talk about. I've been wanting to talk about this more in detail on this channel for quite some time. Don't forget about that giveaway. And as always, keep on hunting. I'll see you at the next video.
Make sure to come down to Sentiment Depot Antiques and Collectibles, where I'm set up with all of my comics, located at 238 West Delaware Ave, Pennington, New Jersey. Open every day except for Monday and Tuesday. Enjoy 10% off from Wednesday to Friday. See you there.